Welcome to Chapter 18, Age of the City. In this chapter, we're going to look at the rise of the city, how cities were built, and how they changed during the Gilded Age. Immigrants were attracted to America for a number of reasons, but the biggest draw was for economic opportunity. Very, very few chose to make the move strictly for religious or political freedom. Immigrants came during times of economic prosperity, but when the American economy was in recession or depression, immigrants stayed put. They did not want to come here. When jobs were plentiful, however, immigration grew. This map is also on page 412 of your book, and it shows our source of immigrants from 1900 to 1920, the Gilded Age that we're talking about. You can see that our biggest numbers were 3.5 million from Southwest Europe and 2.5 million from Russia and Poland. Note that only 270,000 immigrants came from Mexico, and that did not even require oceanic travel. When immigrants arrived in America, they chose their final destination based on the industry in which they wanted to work. For instance, Germans, Scandinavians, Poles, and Bohemians migrated to the wheat fields in the Midwest. Many French Canadians chose the textile mills in New England, while Polish and Russian Jews went to New York to work in the garment industry. Italians seemed to concentrate on construction. But that doesn't mean that nationality dictated their career choice. It was more reasonably their networking that concentrated people in job fields by their nationality. For instance, if you were a Jewish person from Poland and you had an uncle already working in New York's garment industry, he would help you get a job there. So it was more about who you knew and where they were that gave you opportunity in America. With the influx of immigrants at the turn of the century, some Americans were concerned that by living in their neighborhoods that were often referred to as ghettos, that so closely reflected the immigrants' own culture, that these new immigrants to the country would never become good Americans, that they would never become Americanized. Even some immigrants were worried about that. With this growing fear among Americans who were native to the country, now don't confuse that with what we consider as tribal Native Americans. These are Americans who were already living here. This sparked an attitude called nativism. Nativism was an anti-immigrant movement. Natives worried that immigrants were taking all the good jobs or at least driving down salaries and wages. One of the big anti-immigrant examples from the era involved Chinese immigrants in California. Labor unions organized against the cheap immigrant labor and got the Chinese Exclusion Act passed permanently in 1902. It remained in effect until 1943. This anti-immigrant stance reinforced racism. One theory was that people of Nordic descent were better than darker-haired or darker-eyed people of Southern Europe, and then hate groups began to develop around these attitudes. So with the attitude of the pro-Nordic descent and then the attitude that was anti-Chinese, racism really began to develop. Immigrants to America's cities did not just come from foreign countries, though. They also came from rural areas within the United States. Culturally, these rural people may as well have been from another country. Like foreign immigrants, they moved to cities for jobs. They were referred to as buckwheats or hayseeds, but they were respected for their manual labor, and they were often trusted with supervisory positions, generally as long as they were supervising foreign immigrants. American cities were not always pleasant. They were usually dirty and crowded. Coal that was used for heating billowed pollution into the air. Water systems weren't any better. The water supply was not sufficient, and there was no sewer service. It was hard to find decent, affordable housing on top of all of that. When the immigrants did find housing, it was nothing like what they had back home. Instead of living in cottages like most European immigrants once had, they were lucky to find small living quarters in a city apartment building. Education was crucial to immigrants if they wanted economic prosperity. Illiterate immigrants were taken advantage of. Those who couldn't grasp reading and writing skills largely remained at the poverty level. Family life changed for immigrants to America. In rural areas, fathers worked close to their families. In cities, the father was in a factory or business and the family had no access to them during working hours. The physical distance between home and work began to grow. Think about how true that is today. I know people who commute over an hour a day just to get to work. And then, of course, there's an hour to get back home in the evenings. The distance, though, this was a new thing. This distance between work and home created something of a generation gap. There were children growing up without being able to relate to a parent, usually the father, who was gone to work. As the children were raised in American culture, they began to assimilate. Family sizes also got smaller. There was no need to have a big family in the city. Parents just didn't need the extra labor in the fields. Plus, it was more expensive to have more children in the city. Crime was another problem cities had to deal with. There were legal ways to make a living and illegal ways to make a living. If a person chose the illegal route, then there were more people to victimize in a city. Pickpockets were petty thieves that focused on small robberies. Prostitution also became a problem. Saloons were frowned upon because of their association with drunks, but they doubled as a way to attack another city problem, loneliness. It's hard to imagine being lonely in a crowded city, but people who immigrated from close-knit communities had big culture shock in terms of loneliness once they moved to America, especially if they moved alone and without their family. Some large cities had a government problem known as machines. Machines are political organizations that manipulate or bribe whomever necessary to get a chosen candidate or party into office. The purpose was to win and remain in office, often for the benefit of under-the-table financial transactions or political favors. People who sought reform for these political machines were good government reformers, often referred to as goo-goos. Luckily, city problems were addressed. Asphalt was available in the 1870s, making city streets cleaner and safer. Soon it became the city standard. Los Angeles built the first city sewage plant without the benefit of a local river for waste dumping in 1887. And by the time World War I broke out in 1914, almost all large American cities had water treatment systems, which dropped fatalities from cholera, typhoid, and other bacterial illnesses. Then in 1901, New York enacted a law that improved tenant housing by establishing minimum building codes. And we see the movement begin to a city beautification program. Part of improving city life also required addressing transportation needs, especially since people were living farther away from their workplace. By the end of the 1870s, New York City had its first elevated railway commuter train. It was fast, but also really dirty. San Francisco developed the cable car in 1872 to meet its needs created by the hills in that city. In the late 1880s, Richmond, Virginia developed an electric trolley system that was fast and non-polluting. Boston was the first city to develop an underground subway system, but it was really short, at only a mile and a half long. New York City came along and did that bigger and better. Their system opened in 1904 with a 15-mile stretch that started what has become the biggest subway system in the world. If America's goal was to assimilate its new immigrants, they had to establish places to do that. Public schools offered that solution. They only taught the basic skills. Back then, students from large cities performed better than students in rural schools. Today, we see that trend reversed in many places. So in conclusion, many newcomers built the cities of America. Of course, there were problems that needed to be addressed when they arrived and that needed to address the quickly growing population. Billions of dollars were spent to build sewers, public transportation, and municipal services, and governments actually became more efficient during this time.